Hey folks! Today I'll be reviewing Donkey Kong Country. I'll be focusing on its fundamental design decisions and game mechanics, from its art style and music, all the way to the details of the core gameplay. This kind of depth means that it's best if you've played the game already prior to watching this video. I absolutely love this game, and I greatly enjoyed the research process for this project. I hope you enjoy. Donkey Kong Country was released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The footage used in this video comes from the Virtual Console release on the Wii U because it ends up looking a bit nicer once it's encoded on a video platform like YouTube or Twitch. Developed by Rare, it was the first use of Nintendo's Donkey Kong intellectual property built from the ground up by a second-party developer. One of the more interesting details from the game's development is the circumstances of this partnership. Nintendo's investment into Rare stemmed from an impressive technical demo Rare put together using the latest silicon graphics technology. This idea of pushing the envelope of what was possible given existing technology and design paradigms permeates throughout the entire title, nowhere more so than the game's graphical style. Donkey Kong Country features a 2.5D graphical perspective, in which rich 3D models are pre-rendered on powerful machines before being placed into the two-dimensional game. Pre-rendering enables the use of graphical assets that exceed the real-time rendering capabilities of a machine's computational power, critical to enabling a competitive graphical experience on the 16-bit SNES when compared to its 32-bit contemporaries. The result is a visually stunning experience. Rare consistently pushed the limits of the system, featuring everything from day and night cycles to constantly changing weather patterns. Even small details in the modeling are carefully crafted, like the realistic shadow effects in the characters' idle animations. My particular favorite is the way colors pop, especially the bright whites of Ice Age Alley. The lighting effects are one of the best examples of how Rare took the basics of what was available in the game engine and squeezed out as much depth as possible. Flickering effects contribute to the atmosphere of an industrial factory, while subtle transitions from light to dark convey the sense of a deep cave. On a larger scale, player vision in dark areas was explored through a number of different game mechanics, from squawks following the player around to fast-paced sequences based on moving from light switch to light switch before the level goes dark. The underlying theme is stretching the fundamentals and building blocks of the game to deliver as much gameplay depth as possible. Internally, Rare was a competitive company where employees routinely tried to outdo each other, at least until different divisions were isolated for secrecy reasons. The Stamper brothers, the company's founders, pushed employees hard to build the best game possible prior to release. From my perspective, the limitations of the Super Nintendo hardware likely contributed more than they detracted from the final product. The company depended on finding depth within a small number of strong, basic fundamentals to make the game work. The parallax scrolling featured within the title is a great example. If you're not familiar with this concept, it refers to the differing movement speed of graphical assets in order to convey a sense of depth. Assets in the background scroll slower than assets in the foreground, giving the impression that the background is further away. Donkey Kong Country took this a step further, featuring assets in between the camera and the level proper in order to play around with the difficulty, or subtly alter the lighting to build atmosphere. Donkey Kong Country opens up with a minimalistic introductory segment in which the story and mechanics are organically discovered. The level design here is pretty well thought out. Donkey Kong is shown emerging from his house and starts the game right next to the Kong's banana horde. The player is subtly encouraged to explore both areas, setting up the game's narrative as well as introducing the basic mechanics. The decision to include a tire in the starting area is also pretty clever. It forces the player to learn that there's some depth to the mechanics. Timing a jump correctly when bouncing off another object produces a higher jump. Here again we can see how limitations in the hardware, in combination with Rare's "we can do better" culture, forced the designers to put together an introduction that was both concise and effective. The heavy-handed tutorials of predecessors are eliminated while still managing to convey the core gameplay. The story is explained briefly but elegantly, with the banana-filled boss arenas reinforcing the player's underlying goal. Contrast this with the introduction of Tropical Freeze. The title makes a number of odd design decisions in its opening moments. It chooses to emphasize swimming controls before introducing the basics of jumping, strange considering how much more important the latter is to the core gameplay. The same lesson as the first game, timing a jump to bounce higher, is executed much more poorly, with the player only receiving a single opportunity to figure it out before missing a collectible item. Worse still is the thematic inconsistency of the introductory cinematic, priming the player for a snowy blizzard before dropping them into a jungle. My point here isn't to criticize Tropical Freeze. It's an excellent game that I'll be reviewing as part of this series. It's mostly to say that the designers of that game had the luxury of crafting a rich cinematic and building a long introductory level thanks to modern hardware. The Donkey Kong Country team didn't have that, and were therefore forced to do the best they could with what they had. The result is an introduction that is far shorter, yet works much better than the modern title because there was simply more thought put into it. These few seconds in the Kong's Banana Horde resonate much more powerfully than the long and complicated introduction featured in Tropical Freeze. Donkey Kong Country's first level also introduces one of the series' most beloved characters, Rambi the Rhino. Animal companions are unique in Donkey Kong Country because they don't act like a straight-up upgrade, they have pros and cons. Unguard prevents panic swimming to avoid getting hit, Espresso is ineffective at killing enemies, and Winkie is hard to control. This was a good design decision. It favors depth and rewards longtime players by enabling multiple ways of clearing a level. The upgrade system present in games like Super Mario World seems like it offers better rewards at first glance, but in truth it mostly only helps new players. I think this explains why Donkey Kong Country often hides animal companions in bonus rooms or other hard to reach areas. The type of player who explores these sections doesn't need additional help clearing the game. They'd rather have depth, complexity, and replayability. Rambi is the exception to this design paradigm, acting as an objectively superior version of the two Kongs. It's no surprise that many players look back and view him with nostalgia. He's fun to use, easy to handle, and very powerful. He also makes it almost impossible to miss the game's first bonus room, teaching players that there are secrets to be found if they look hard enough. The design here is simple, but it works. The player collects a bunch of bananas, hears some nice music, and feels like they discovered something cool. It's noteworthy that this is one of the few bonus rooms that is impossible to fail, meaning that it can only act to encourage players to find more. This really highlights Donkey Kong Country's core gameplay. It's challenging and emphasizes patience. Unlike Super Mario World, Donkey Kong has very little momentum when moving through a level. This gives levels a natural pacing, in which an obstacle can be observed and understood before being tackled. Breaking up levels into these discrete, individually designed challenges delivers a sense of incremental progress. The player is deeply engaged when working their way through the game world. They're not thinking about reaching the end, they're thinking about the specific challenge directly in front of them. The design encourages them to focus on this one specific thing, making it much more rewarding when they get through it. This simple reward loop, seeing an obstacle, solving the obstacle, and reaching a point of safety to appreciate what's been achieved, is deeply satisfying and is a huge part of what makes Donkey Kong Country work. More difficult levels force the player to move through the world without stopping, with the minecart levels taking this design paradigm to its theoretical limit. It's worth noting that every level can actually be completed in this way. The level design here is really elegant. Players on their first playthrough carefully navigate the game's most difficult sections and feel a sense of achievement on a moment-to-moment basis. On subsequent playthroughs, they can fly through with ease, reinforcing their sense of mastery. In general, Donkey Kong Country is not a particularly hard game, though its fundamental approach to difficulty is a case study in good game design. Each new mechanic is introduced in a simple way and then progressively made more challenging to keep players engaged. Kensuke Tanabe, a producer at Nintendo, explains this approach as it's typically applied in Nintendo games. Perhaps one of the core principles of building gameplay at Nintendo might be the idea of starting with a really simple intuitive core concept, one that, say, a child could learn from themselves and quickly learn to enjoy, and then build layers of additional complexity around that could be enjoyed and explored by people who have the skill level to exploit them. The most critical effect of this difficulty design is the way it keeps the player engaged throughout the gameplay experience. Donkey Kong Country is a game that requires a certain level of focus from the player, and the way levels flow when a player is smoothly moving from one challenge to another matches the flow state of the player's brain when concentrating on the game. No challenge is so difficult that it breaks immersion. The difficulty curve gently climbs upward, pulling the player deeper into the game world. In combination with the punishing nature of dying after one or two hits, the careful level arrangements produce a deeply engaging gameplay experience that would likely not be felt if the game were substantially easier. The bonus rooms feed into this engagement by giving players even more reason to carefully pay attention to their surroundings. I'm personally of the opinion that most bonus rooms weren't meant to be explicitly hunted down, in the sense that the developers didn't expect players to reach 100% completion by the end of their first playthrough. Bonus rooms instead act to keep the player engaged and add additional things for players to think about as they move through a level. Meticulous item placement and camera work keeps players thinking about the level design. It once again emphasizes patience and mastery over split-second reflexes. The 60 bonus rooms offered in Donkey Kong Country are actually fairly sparse, with only a handful offering a compelling gameplay situation. This is one of the key reasons I see them as something intended to be looked for, but not necessarily found. Completing them is relatively unsatisfying, and the rewards are fairly trivial. The same can be said for the Animal Companion bonus areas. It's rewarding to look for the animal icons, but not necessarily rewarding to actually find them. These are areas that would see significant redesign in later iterations of the series, but I think the underlying message remains the same. The core experience is the base game. The various secrets act primarily to give it depth and replayability. Related to this subject is the title's actual length. When I sat down to plan this project, I clearly remembered playing this game for months on end, so I expected something similar when I started a new playthrough. I was as surprised as anybody when I finished the game in less than 3 hours, though with most of the bonus rooms left untouched. I think this speaks to many things, especially the impossible task of a mainstream title's difficulty holding up for someone who continued to play platform games for 2 decades after the game came out. There's also a certain ruthless efficiency that comes from years of playing games, a certain inability to just take things slow and appreciate a title for what it is. But mostly, I mention this because of what came next. I continued to play the game even after I had shot the footage I needed for this project. I started to remember why I had played the title for months on end, because it was simply fun to play, over and over again. The title has an enormous amount of underlying complexity that makes it fascinating to replay. There are subtle differences in movement speed and other characteristics between Donkey and Diddy Kong. Barrels can be set down or rolled on to make accessing secrets easier. Timing jumps correctly enables higher bounces. Rolling into enemies increases movement speed, etc. My point is that there's more to liking old games than just nostalgia. The fundamental development limitations of that era forced developers to extract more depth and build stronger systems with what they had to work with. There's not much room for filler content in 32 megabytes. When a title can only contain so many gameplay mechanics, there's a strong incentive to make each one work really well. I think this is one of the truisms of game design, even on modern hardware. The presence of content is less important than its underlying execution. Naturally, Donkey Kong Country doesn't always execute perfectly. The game's various non-player characters, Cranky, Candy, and Funky, serve a clear purpose, but their implementation leaves a lot to be desired. Cranky is probably the best of the bunch, acting as a voice for the developers to tease players and provide hints. There's a good pacing to discovering Cranky in a world. It's an opportunity to take a rest and get some tips on how to unlock more bonus rooms. Aside from that, Donkey Kong Country's biggest weakness is arguably its uneven pacing, which both Candy and Funky contribute to. I think it's unlikely that the developers wanted players to clear a level and immediately traverse back to a save point, but this is ultimately what ends up happening. There's little upside for continuing forward, knowing that you can lose your progress. This interferes with the player's sense of flow, and acts more as an annoyance than a break, making levels seem more imposing than they really are. It also creates a sense of panic when players unlock a new world and are unable to traverse backward to save the game. Rather than feeling a sense of accomplishment, they're biding their time until they get to a new save point. The boss fights at the end of each world break up the pacing in a negative way as well. They're comically easy to the point that players don't really need to exercise the game's core mechanics to get past them. They serve mostly as a chore to get through if the player loses all of their lives in the next world. The inclusion of a boss is often a good way to convey progress to the player or mentally prepare them for a new area, but they serve neither purpose in Donkey Kong Country. Given the sudden difficulty increase of King K. Rool, I would guess that the designers originally intended boss fights to be harder, but backtracked when this came into conflict with the game's saving mechanism. I don't even think we can blame Nintendo for this one. The first boss in Super Mario World is significantly more difficult than any of those found in Donkey Kong Country. The most I can say here is that at least the boss arenas reinforce the player's goal of retrieving Donkey Kong's banana hoard. I think the last thing I want to touch upon is the game's fundamental style. So far we've gone deep into many individual mechanics, but where Donkey Kong Country really shines, and the reason I feel it ultimately holds up even to this day, is in how these mechanics come together. The title has an undeniable charm that permeates every nook and cranny. The art design is simple but rich. My strongest memory of my first playthrough is the twinkling neon pink lights of one of the later levels. The sound design is impeccable, and would go on to produce several classic pieces. I don't think anyone who's played Donkey Kong Country can forget aquatic ambiance. I honestly think it's one of the best tracks ever made for a video game, given how perfectly it meshes with the game's water exploration. For me personally, Donkey Kong Country's sound design is simply unforgettable, and one of the things I look forward to most when playing new iterations in the series. The backing tracks compare favorably to the more frantic tunes of similar titles, and pair well with the game's slower, more methodical pacing. The sound effects are well crafted. The simple tune that plays when the player finds a new bonus room feels really good to listen to. The art, music, gameplay, and writing come together in a very complementary way. Donkey Kong Country is one of the few titles where I can genuinely say that the whole really is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what it really comes down to. Donkey Kong Country is a fantastic 2D platformer that manages to hold up more than 20 years after its original release. Its core mechanics are thought through and well implemented. Its art style is rich and colorful. Its sound design is superb. The development team's mantra, "Make it better," is visible everywhere you look. The game's uneven pacing and poorly developed boss fights stand in stark contrast to the fundamentals that work really well, and this is an area that we'll continue to focus on in this series. Thank you so much for watching. Next time, we'll be looking at Donkey Kong Country 2. All the best, and see you next time.